Hey guys, tonight we're going back to July 1776. You can dim the lights, sip your tea, and let your phone slowly slip from your hand as we unravel the story behind what is probably the most famous breakup text in world history, the Declaration of Independence. You know the one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and so on. The part everyone quotes but few could finish without looking it up. It's the document that launched a country, inspired revolutions, and ironically, was written by men who couldn't quite agree on what freedom actually meant. So, let's settle in and talk about how a bunch of colonists, many of them wealthy, landowning men with questionable hygiene, decided they'd had enough of King George III. And, as always, it's not nearly as noble or tidy as your high school textbook pretended. Because behind the fireworks and bold signatures, the Declaration was less a lightning bolt of liberty and more a slow-motion divorce, with letters, committees, passive-aggressive drafts, and a lot of people who really just wanted to be left alone to tax themselves in peace. The colonial mood. We're not mad, just disappointed. By the 1770s, life in the colonies was getting complicated. For decades, Britain had been busy ignoring them, the delightful policy known as salutary neglect. Basically, as long as the colonies sent raw materials and didn't burn everything down, London was happy to pretend the Atlantic Ocean was a polite excuse to not get involved. Taxes popped up like mushrooms after rain. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, all designed to remind the colonists that yes, they were still Britain's side project. Each act came with a cheery new tax and the unspoken message, you don't get a say in this, but thanks for asking. Colonists were not amused. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. Though, to be fair, many of the same men shouting that also had no problem denying representation to their own servants, women, or enslaved people. But nuance wasn't the mood of the day. King George III, the awkward villain. Now, let's meet the supposed bad guy of this story, King George III. He's usually remembered as the tyrant who lost America, cue the dramatic violin sting. But in reality, George wasn't actually twirling his mustache and plotting colonial doom, he was just kind of a micromanager. George III was earnest, dutiful, and painfully serious. He woke up early, avoided mistresses, which was rare for a king, and genuinely thought he was doing the right thing, which is always the most dangerous kind of ruler, the one convinced he's being reasonable. Unfortunately, his reasonable included things like approving taxes without input, sending troops to enforce order, and ignoring letters that started with, "Your Majesty, we'd like to discuss." So, while the colonists saw tyranny, George saw a group of ungrateful teenagers threatening to move out and start their own government. Both sides had points. Both sides were frankly insufferable. Tea, tantrums, and the road to independence. Let's talk tea, because somehow the entire revolution got reduced to a drink order. In 1773, Britain gave the struggling East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, which didn't go over well. American merchants were furious, and colonists were like, "We're already taxed enough, and now you're telling us what tea to drink?" The Boston Tea Party followed, which was less than a party and more of a drunken, soggy protest featuring men in disguises and an alarming disregard for property. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The next morning, Boston smelled like an oversteeped disaster. Britain responded with the coercive acts, or as the colonists dubbed them, the intolerable acts, closing Boston's port and effectively grounding the entire city until someone apologized. Spoiler, no one apologized. Instead, representatives from the colonies met in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. The goal was to coordinate a response to Britain's latest tantrum, but it mostly turned into a long, awkward meeting where no one wanted to take full responsibility. John Adams wrote later that it was like 13 clocks striking as one, which sounds poetic until you realize he meant that none of the clocks actually agreed on what time it was. Jefferson joins the chat. By 1776, things had spiraled. Battles had already broken out at Lexington and Concord. The British had been officially labeled "those guys we're shooting at now." And Congress decided it was time to make it official, a declaration. Enter Jefferson. Tall, quiet, fond of violins, and extremely sure of himself when it came to writing. When it came time to pick someone to draft the big letter to Britain, Congress chose him partly because he was from Virginia, which helped balance regional egos, and partly because he was less likely than John Adams to offend everyone in the room. Jefferson got to work in his rented Pennsylvania room, scratching out sentences on a portable desk. He pulled inspiration from John Locke, Enlightenment ideals, and frankly, a few pamphlets he'd read earlier that week. What he produced was poetic, ambitious, and more than a little hypocritical. "All men are created equal," wrote the man who owned over 600 enslaved people in his lifetime. The irony would hang over his legacy forever, though at the time, no one in Congress seemed too bothered. Editing the dream. When Jefferson proudly presented his draft, Congress immediately began doing what committees do best, editing it to death. Benjamin Franklin, ever the diplomat, offered gentle improvements, changing "sacred and undeniable" to "self-evident," which honestly does sound smoother. John Adams mostly approved, though he probably reminded everyone he could have written it better. But the biggest edits came when Jefferson's rant about slavery got deleted. He had included a passionate paragraph condemning the Crown for perpetuating the slave trade, a bold stance coming from him. Southern delegates, whose wealth relied on slavery, were not amused. The paragraph vanished faster than you can say economic interest. Jefferson sulked, Congress voted, and on July 4th, 1776, they approved a slightly sanitized version, one that focused on grievances everyone could agree on, like taxes and troop quartering, rather than the moral rot of slavery. They signed it in stages, sent copies around the colonies, and pretended everything was unanimous harmony. In reality, half the room was still nervously checking the door, wondering when British troops would show up.
There were bonfires, bells rang. Some towns held mock funerals for King George, complete with effigies and awkwardly cheerful eulogies. Meanwhile, in London, George III was informed that his colonies had declared independence. His reported reaction? Calm disbelief, followed by mild irritation. The war dragged on for years, but the Declaration lived on as a symbol, more ideal than reality. It promised liberty and equality, but only for a select group. The rest, women, Native Americans, enslaved Africans, would have to wait centuries for their names to even appear in the conversation. Still, it was a start, a messy, imperfect start, written in ink and irony. And as we'll see, the men who signed it didn't exactly get the peaceful, glorious afterlife history textbooks promised. Let's float very gently into that part next, because the Founding Fathers' lives after 1776 were a cocktail of debts, deaths, and disappointments. So, July 4th came and went. The ink dried. The signatures, some elegant, some resembling a doctor's note, were collected. And then, well, nothing got easier. Because once you tell the most powerful empire in the world, "We're done with you," you have to actually run the thing you just declared free. Which, it turns out, was harder than writing poetic sentences about liberty. John Adams, the overachiever who couldn't sit still. Let's start with John Adams, the man who was absolutely painfully sure he'd be remembered as the true architect of American independence. Adams was brilliant, fiery, and exhausting. Even his friends admitted that being around him too long felt like being lectured by a thundercloud. He spent the early years after 1776 bouncing between Congress, European embassies, and long letters to his wife Abigail, which are lovely, by the way, full of genuine affection and occasional grumpy rants about other delegates. When Adams wasn't arguing policy, he was writing about how underappreciated he felt. Posterity, he complained, will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve its freedom. Translation: Please remember that I worked harder than Jefferson. He eventually became America's first vice president, a job he once described as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Then came the presidency in 1797, which was awkward. Adams inherited a fragile new nation, still broke from the war, with political factions forming like storm clouds. He managed to avoid another war with France, which was good, but he also signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically allowed the government to arrest people who criticized it. So, not exactly freedom of speech vibes. He lost re-election to Thomas Jefferson, his old friend turned rival, and retired to his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, bitter but oddly peaceful. In his later years, Adams mellowed out, writing letters to Jefferson again as if their political feud had been a long, weird dream, and in one of those perfectly timed historical coincidences that feel scripted, Adams died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. His last words? Thomas Jefferson still survives. Except Jefferson didn't. He had died just a few hours earlier. You can't make that up. Speaking of Jefferson, let's talk about the man who wrote the Declaration and then spent the rest of his life quietly regretting how expensive ideals could be. Jefferson was, in many ways, a contradiction wrapped in a vice-coat. He talked endlessly about freedom and equality while owning hundreds of enslaved people. He envisioned a simple, agrarian America, but lived like a European aristocrat. After the war, he became America's minister to France, where he developed a taste for fine wine, expensive architecture, and, let's just say, complicated relationships. When he returned home, he was horrified by the rough partisan brawling that defined early American politics. And then he joined in anyway. His presidency, 1801 to 1809, was equal parts idealism and irony. He preached limited government and then made the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the country overnight without explicit constitutional approval. He opposed war, but embargoed nearly all foreign trade, tanking the economy. By the time he retired, Jefferson was drowning in debt, partly because of his extravagant lifestyle and endless building projects at Monticello, his mountaintop mansion that he kept improving until it nearly bankrupted him. In old age, he corresponded warmly with Adams, reflecting on philosophy, liberty, and mortality, while enslaved laborers kept his household running. He died, as we mentioned, on July 4th, 1826, the same day as Adams, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. Poetic, if deeply on the nose. When visitors came to Monticello after his death, they found elegant ruins, both literal and moral. Jefferson had left behind enormous debts, an unfinished vision, and the haunting question, how can a man write about liberty while denying it to others? Benjamin Franklin, the eternal pragmatist. Now let's drift toward everyone's favorite 18th century multitasker, Benjamin Franklin, printer, inventor, diplomat, scientist, alleged flirt, and at one point, probably the most famous American in Europe. By 1776, he was already an elder statesman. In his 70s, gouty, but still sharper than everyone else in the room. He helped edit the Declaration, charmed the French into supporting the Revolution, and generally behaved like the world's most competent grandfather. After independence, Franklin returned home a legend. Philadelphia adored him. He served as the state's president, basically governor, helped abolish slavery in Pennsylvania, and wrote a constitution for his state while sipping tea in his garden. Franklin aged gracefully, if you can call constant pain and limited mobility graceful. He kept writing witty essays until the end, often reflecting on morality, science, and the absurdity of politics. When he died in 1890, Over 20,000 people attended his funeral, which, for perspective, was roughly 1/3 of Philadelphia's population at the time. His epitaph? He once suggested it himself. The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. Even in death, the man had a way with words.
George Washington, the reluctant saint. And then there was George. Everyone's favorite stoic, marble-faced icon, George Washington. He didn't actually sign the Declaration, which surprises people. By July 1776, he was already commanding the Continental Army, too busy losing early battles to show up in Philadelphia. But he became the face of the revolution anyway, mostly because he looked the part, tall, composed, and allergic to smiling. After the war, he wanted nothing more than to retire quietly to Mount Vernon. But of course, everyone begged him to become president, because apparently, if you win a war, you automatically get stuck running the country you just made up. Washington accepted, reluctantly. He set precedents, avoided monarchic vibes, and spent most of his time trying to keep Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson from strangling each other. When he finally retired after 2 terms, he delivered a farewell address that basically said, "Please don't form political parties, and whatever you do, avoid foreign entanglements." Naturally, the country ignored both pieces of advice almost immediately. He spent his final years farming, inspecting fields, and writing polite letters about agriculture, until one freezing night ride gave him a sore throat that turned fatal. He died in 1799, still worried about national unity. His last words were reportedly, "'Tis well." A man of few words, right to the end. The others vanished into the footnotes. Of course, not everyone became a legend. Many of the other signers of the Declaration quietly faded from history, their fame evaporating like spilled ink. Some died in poverty. Others were hunted, imprisoned, or lost everything during the war. A few lived long enough to see their free nation divided by political infighting and hypocrisy. Francis Lewis saw his home destroyed and his wife die in British captivity. Thomas Lynch Jr. vanished at sea on a voyage to France, possibly a metaphor for how fast revolutionary idealism can drown. And Richard Stockton, once a respected lawyer, was captured by the British, imprisoned, and released in ruins. He died penniless. The Declaration had promised liberty, equality, and happiness. What most of its authors got instead were bills, illness, and mild existential despair. The Declaration's legacy, the dream and the dust. By the early 19th century, the Declaration of Independence had become more myth than document. It was quoted at ceremonies, printed on posters, and taught to children as sacred scripture. But its ideals remained selectively applied. Women couldn't vote, slavery persisted, Native Americans were being pushed off their lands. Yet, generation after generation, people read Jefferson's words and decided they applied to them too, regardless of what the founders had intended. And maybe that's the real beauty of it. The document that began as a political complaint became, over time, a living promise, one that kept stretching to include more and more of the people it once excluded. As the 1800s rolled on, the men who signed the Declaration were gone, their bones scattered, their names turned into street signs and county fairs. But the thing they wrote, that sleepy July draft full of edits, contradictions, and hope, somehow endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it was human, fragile, flawed, and stubbornly optimistic. Let's float a bit further next into how the Declaration was rediscovered, romanticized, and occasionally rewritten in America's collective memory. because what began as a practical protest slowly transformed into something closer to religion. Let's start with an uncomfortable truth. For the first few decades after 1776, hardly anyone treated the Declaration like a big deal. It wasn't the nation's founding document, that was the Constitution. It wasn't the law, it was basically an old letter everyone vaguely respected but didn't reread. In fact, most people didn't even know where the original copy was half the time. It got rolled up, moved around, shoved into drawers, and at one point stored behind wallpaper during the War of 1812, because apparently America's sacred text was just fine chilling next to a broom. No one was memorizing, "We hold these truths" yet. That would come later, when nostalgia, nationalism, and just the right amount of selective memory turned it into a legend. The 1820s were weirdly sentimental. 50 years had passed since independence, and suddenly Americans started realizing that the Founding Fathers were, well, mortal and dying fast. Jefferson and Adams' eerie synchronized deaths on the 50th anniversary kicked off a national mood swing. Newspapers ran columns calling it divine providence, as if heaven had scheduled their exits from maximum symbolism. Sermons were preached, paintings commissioned. The revolution became a memory wrapped in myth. People wanted heroes now, not humans. Artists began depicting the signing of the Declaration as this noble, candlelit ceremony, all harmony and purpose. In reality, half the delegates weren't even there on July 4th. The signing took weeks. Some people added their names later, and the room? Hot, stuffy, and buzzing with flies. But 40 sweaty guys arguing over commas doesn't exactly make inspiring art. So America cleaned it up. The painting by John Trumbull, the one you've seen on the back of the $2 bill, shows elegant men gathered around Jefferson like apostles. That's not a historical moment. It's a religious one. The Declaration had officially been canonized. The cult of 1776. By the mid-19th century, 1776 became more than a date. It became a brand. Politicians invoked it, protesters quoted it. It was engraved, embroidered, carved, and endlessly referenced, the shorthand for everything good and pure about the American experiment. Even people who didn't agree with each other used it. Abolitionists cited the Declaration to argue for the end of slavery. Slaveholders quoted it too, insisting it was about political independence, not human rights. Everyone cherry-picked Jefferson's words like an all-you-can-eat buffet of moral justification. Then came 1852, when Frederick Douglass, formerly enslaved, now a brilliant orator, gave his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." He praised the founders for their courage, but reminded the audience that their words rang hollow in a country still practicing slavery. "Your celebration is a sham," he said. That moment cracked the myth, even if most people politely ignored the sound. Because myths are comfortable. Reality is not. The Civil War, when the dream collapsed on itself. By the 1860s, the Declaration's promise, "all men are created equal," had become the nation's biggest contradiction. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was obsessed with it. He believed the Declaration was the moral foundation of the Union, the one sacred text that proved America had been intended to move toward freedom, even if it hadn't quite gotten there yet. At Gettysburg, Lincoln referenced it again, describing the United States as conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He didn't quote Jefferson directly, but everyone knew the source. Lincoln was trying to reclaim the myth, to remind people that even flawed words could light a path forward. Of course, the war killed over 600,000 people, so the price of that ideal was steep. But by the end, the Declaration's language had been reborn, not as a document of complaint, but as a national creed, the 20th century, framing the dream. Fast forward a few decades. America's cities were taller, louder, and less reflective. But the Declaration still hung around, now literally behind glass. In 1921, the original parchment, faded, cracked, and barely legible, was officially placed in the Library of Congress, framed like an artifact from a vanished civilization. People lined up to stare at it through protective glass, whispering reverentially as if looking at holy relics. Then in 1952, it was moved again, this time to the National Archives, where it still rests today, under low light and nitrogen gas, like a sleeping ghost. Guards stand nearby. The ink is almost gone. The paper, once handled casually, is now treated like it might evaporate if you breathe too hard. Meanwhile, the myth only grew.